The Vietnam War is a funny thing. The expression itself has become a household name and almost the main meme of the planet. But at the same time, will you be able to tell right off the bat why the conflict started, what the parties wanted and how the war ended in general? Don't worry, we'll do everything for you now. In the next couple of minutes, you will learn the meaning of Johnny's phrase, "not in the trees," get to know the charming Viet song and become an expert in any dispute. Don't switch. To begin with, we will once again demonstrate Vietnam on the world map. This is an elongated country located under China and next to Thailand, the Philippines and other hot resort destinations. These guys have never been bored even without Americans. Over the millennial history of the days when peace reigned in Vietnam, you can count on your fingers. But in 1857, France decided that the Vietnamese were not democratic enough, and after a long war made the country its colony. This continued until the end of World War II, but here it is worth noting an important fact: since 1860 there has been a powerful independence movement in Vietnam. And in fact, the beginning of the Vietnam War can be considered 1941st year. Why is it so early? It was then that the Viet Minh was officially created, an organization led by Ho Chi Minh City that wanted independence. At that time, Vietnam was still French on paper, but in fact it was completely occupied by Japan. It's World War II, remember? And it turned out to be a very funny situation. On the one hand, Vietnam fought against France, destroying its colonial army, and on the other, the Japanese also fell under the distribution, so that in fact, in World War II, Vietnam acted against everyone at the same time. Which, however, did not prevent the US president from calling Ho Chi Minh a hero 20 years before he became enemy number one. In 1945, when Japan fell, the Viet Minh had only one enemy left: Vietnam's War of Independence against France, and a small expeditionary force of England is called the First Indochina War. But to be honest, this is one protracted conflict, because it was here that the guys from the USA came on the scene. Why? Because the aforementioned Viet Minh was socialist to the last member. On the 2nd of September, 1945, the guys announced the independence and formation of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, which on paper was communist. And the Americans were not satisfied with the appearance of a powerful socialist camp. Therefore, the guys helped the French in every possible way with advisors, financing and, of course, ammunition. The famous smell of napalm in the morning was first tasted not by American Johns, but by French Emmanuels, because from 1945 to 54 years they tried to maintain control over the colony, and in 1954, 10 years before the full-scale intervention, the United States already paid for 80% of military operations. That is, roughly speaking, they fought on the side of the French, who merged in the most incompetent way. Although, it would seem, less than 100,000 Vietnamese, who could not be called an army, opposed the 115,000th, well-equipped corps of France, possessing tanks, planes and napalm of the Allies. Until 1954, Viet Minh never got a single tank or ship. However, he won. And Vietnam, according to Korean drawings, was divided into two parts. The northern one up to the 17th parallel was occupied by the DRV, while the south remained under French control. But not for long, because here we come to the key moment of the war. And it is that, unlike the Koreans, the Vietnamese were united and did not want division into two countries. The guys were demanding elections, which seemed to be scheduled for 1956. But it didn't work out by itself. The US was too itchy a communist pain in the ass. Well, it was the red-assed ones who were the main political force in Vietnam. The very founder of the Viet Minh, Ho Chi Minh, became president, and the northern part of the country followed the merry path of repression, execution and other joys of life that accompanied communism around the world. According to various estimates, the Viet Minh killed from 5% to half of its own population under fictitious pretexts. Nevertheless, he was supported even in the south. Already in 1957, communist uprisings began to break out one after another in the countryside of South Vietnam. It was the villagers who were driving and the most terrible military force, because the guys had been fighting for generations with their neighbors, then with the French, then with the Chinese. China, by the way, led the USSR in a race for influence on the communists of Vietnam and in general won it. However, globally, both countries opposed the United States and slowly supplied North Vietnam with tanks, weapons and specialists. Actually, this helped the DRV to get stronger, so much so that the communists began to lick their lips on the sweet southern lands. And there, as we have already mentioned, they were very much supported. And not even for ideological reasons, but because the Vietnamese from the South felt like a colony of the United States and allies. This is not South Korea, which quietly surrendered to the mercy of the winners. The Vietnamese on both sides wanted independence. And therefore, the South Vietnamese government could not cope with the uprisings on its own. Since 1961, the United States has been transferring troops to Vietnam, and 1965 is considered the year of the beginning of full-fledged military operations by the regular army of the Americans, and the year when the United States started a war that they would humiliatingly lose. General Norman Schwarzkopf calls the mistake of these troops. Is that really the case? After all, as we have mentioned 1,000 times, the Vietnamese were united. What was happening in the country was considered a civil war. But when the Americans intervened, many Southerners fled to the north and became partisans. As a result, not half of the country opposed the United States, but a good 2/3. 2.5 million Americans passed through Vietnam. Almost 60,000 of them died, and more than 300,000 remained wounded. In 1968, there were 550,000 soldiers in the country at the same time, and the average age of the dead was 23 years and 11 months. That is, the real color of the American nation has fallen in Vietnam. Why did this happen? Because we are talking about the most powerful army on the planet. That's because Norman Schwarzkopf was right. The National Liberation Front of South Vietnam, better known as the Viet Cong, is not a classic army, but a 1,000-strong horde of guerrillas. The United States and Commander-in-Chief William Westmoreland adopted the find and destroy doctrine. It implied the active use of intelligence and the burning of enemy units, as it should be in a classic war. But the trouble is that there were no enemy units. The Viet Cong, along with the North Vietnamese army, used terror tactics for a long time. The American military police in the period from the 60s to the 70s recorded more than 1,000 terrorist attacks per month. In parallel with this, small detachments of Vietnamese were literally everywhere. They dug tunnels, hid in trees and slept in the mountains. After all, Vietnam is one big jungle and it's easy to hide there. The Americans planned to fight with the regular army and screwed up, getting thousands of partisans instead. They fought everything in a row, starting with Japanese rifles of the Second World War and ending with captured German weapons. An excellent knowledge of the area, coupled with a total desire for independence, created magical things. Take bombs, for example. During the entire Second World War, the Allies dropped 2,700,000 tons of bombs on Germany. Do you know how much in less than 10 years the United States has thrown on Vietnam? 6,727,000, almost 3 times more. And the result was zero, because the scheme to find and destroy completely failed. And the further the situation got worse. North Vietnam began to help the Viet Cong with weapons along the path passing through neighboring Laos. And along with this, the Viet Cong received Soviet, Chinese and other types of equipment. According to experts, it was the supply of Soviet S-75 air defense systems that largely decided the outcome of the war, because they were very well opposed to American aircraft. And already in 1969, the United States realized the mistakes and began to withdraw troops slowly. There were many reasons. Firstly, there was no military progress. No one could even approximate the number of Viet Cong and where they are. Secondly, the Americans finally realized that the Vietnamese did not like interference in their affairs, and the United States decided to switch to supporting the South Vietnamese army under their control. And thirdly, the American army has ceased to be combat ready. In 1970, every 5th U.S. serviceman in the country took drugs. 65 out of 335,000. And who are we to blame them? Every day the guys woke up and did not know if they would live to dinner, because every 10th died. Endless stretching, bombs, explosions and terrorist attacks bored everyone, and there was no end to the war. In fact, the Americans came out of the war like beaten dogs. Although as of 1972, the Communists controlled only 10% of South Vietnam. And in 1973, peace was concluded, one of the conditions of which was the complete withdrawal of U.S. troops. And as soon as the Americans did this, the Viet Cong and the Communist Army went on the offensive. It went with varying success, but South Vietnam, which had practically lost American aid, fell. On April 30, 1975, the Communists raised a banner over the Independence Palace in Saigon. The Democratic Republic of Vietnam officially won, despite the fact that the whole world was against it. In addition to the United States, South Korea, Australia, Japan, Taiwan and other guys helped South Vietnam. However, do not forget that the Viet Cong themselves were actively and generously supported by the Communist brothers. Former Soviet officer Mark Sternberg wrote about 4 divisions of Soviet fighter jets and pilots who fought with the Americans in the air under Vietnamese names. This is readily believed, because the Cold War was at its peak. Well, the participation of 95 S-75 air defense systems, along with personnel, is officially confirmed at all. Summarizing all of the above, I would like to note that getting into the disassembly of foreign countries is such an occupation. The key moment of the Americans' loss in the war was their participation in it, and the footage of the withdrawal of troops still remains a shameful page in the history of the US Army. Well, in global history, this is another example of how big uncles decided to play a war game on someone else's field. The civil conflict of a single country resulted in a mini-world war, where a dozen countries took part on both sides. And according to the most conservative estimates, these amusements have claimed 5 million lives, the vast majority of which are civilians. Civilians who won't really notice the difference between communists and capitalists. Civilians who do not understand geopolitics and the interests of presidents. Civilians who just want to live, not die. Ironically, they are the ones who become a bargaining chip in global conflicts. And as modern history shows, the experience of Vietnam has not taught the planet anything. See you again, friends.